Alpha King bought a blind Omega abandoned by her father, then found out she could see. Snow was falling when the most feared cattleman in the high country laid down silver to claim the girl no one else wanted. Her father spat in the dirt and called her useless, blind, a burden fit for the cold. But on the ride to his mountain cabin under the shadow of the pines, she ducked a low branch he never warned her about. Eyes sharp, steps sure. She could see. And if she could see, then what else was she hiding? He'd saved her from the street, but the storm was only beginning. Because in these mountains, a lie can save your life or get you killed. Now, whispers in town say she ain't his by law. A land thief circles his pasture, and her father's not done selling what he never owned. When the church bell falls silent and the snow melts to mud, one choice will decide everything: protect the truth or protect each other. Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. The winter livestock auction bustled with activity, despite the biting cold that swept through the Colorado high country. Levi Hale stood apart from the restless crowd, his tall frame wrapped in a heavy wool coat as he methodically inspected the few remaining cattle. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy auction yard, and his breath came out in white puffs as he made mental notes about which animals might be worth adding to his herd before the heavy snows arrived. The auctioneer's familiar drone echoed through the yard, rhythmic and steady until it suddenly faltered. A commotion near the front platform drew everyone's attention. Levi looked up to see a man stumbling forward, his weathered face flushed with drink. The man's rough hands were clamped around a young woman's arm, dragging her before the crowd like just another piece of livestock. "Here's something else for sale!" Ezekiel Quinn's voice carried across the yard, slurred but loud. "My daughter! She's blind and useless to me. Can't work, can't cook proper." He gave the young woman a shake that made her stumble. "Trade her for winter provisions. Someone must have use for her." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Angry mutters rippled through the gathered ranchers and farmers. Several women turned away in disgust, while a few of the rougher men exchanged meaningful looks that made Levi's blood run cold. The young woman, barely more than 20 by his estimate, kept her face turned downward, her long dark hair falling forward to hide her expression. Levi's jaw clenched tight as he watched her father sway on his feet, still gripping her arm hard enough to leave bruises. The girl hadn't made a sound, hadn't struggled, but Levi could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell, but something in her quiet dignity struck him to his core. Without conscious thought, his boots were carrying him forward through the parting crowd. The snow had started falling again, fat flakes catching in the girl's dark hair as Levi approached the platform. He pulled a thick fold of cash from his coat, money he'd brought for cattle, and slapped it down on the wooden surface. "That's enough for your winter provisions," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Now let her go." Ezekiel's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he counted the money. Then a mean smile spread across his face. He shoved his daughter forward so suddenly she nearly fell. "She's your problem now, Hale." Levi steadied the girl with a gentle hand on her elbow, keeping his touch light and careful. He could feel the cold radiating through her thin coat, hardly proper wear for a mountain winter. Without another word to Ezekiel, he guided her toward where his horse waited. The girl, Tessa, he remembered her name was, moved with surprising sureness despite her supposed blindness. She found the stirrup without fumbling when he helped her mount, her hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled tension. Levi swung up behind her, gathering the reins and turning them toward the mountain trail that led to his ranch. Ezekiel's mocking laughter followed them out of the auction yard, carried on the bitter wind along with a few snowflakes. Levi felt Tessa's slight frame stiffen at the sound, but she remained silent, her face turned away from both her father and the watching crowd. The trail home wound up into the mountains, growing steeper and narrower as they climbed. The afternoon light was fading fast, the peaks ahead already turned a deep purple against the graying sky. Levi kept his horse to a steady walk, mindful of his passenger's supposed disability. "Trail narrows here," he warned quietly. "Drop off to the right." Tessa nodded slightly but said nothing. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions, but Levi didn't press her. The girl had endured enough for one day without him demanding explanations. They continued climbing, the snow falling more heavily now. Levi was focused on the darkening trail when movement caught his eye. Ahead, a low-hanging pine branch stretched across their path, weighted down with snow. Before he could warn her, Tessa ducked smoothly beneath it, her timing perfect for someone who supposedly couldn't see. Levi's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, but he kept his voice neutral as he spoke. "Careful of that branch." He saw her shoulders tense slightly, realizing her mistake, but she remained silent, her hands still locked on the saddle horn as they continued their slow climb into the gathering darkness. The snow was falling steadily now, and the temperature dropping with the sun. Levi could feel Tessa shivering despite her efforts to hide it. Without comment, he shrugged out of his heavy coat, keeping one hand on the reins as he draped it around her shoulders. She stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed as the warmth enveloped her. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it over the whisper of falling snow. It was the first time she'd spoken since he'd brought her away from the auction yard. Her voice was soft but clear, with none of the hesitation he might have expected from someone who truly couldn't see. The mystery of her supposed blindness nagged at him, but he pushed the questions aside. There would be time enough for answers later. For now, his priority was getting them both safely home before full dark and the bitter night settled over the mountains. The snow began falling more heavily as they climbed higher into the mountains. Levi urged his horse forward, breaking trail through the deepening white powder. Behind him, Tessa followed on the spare mare he'd given her to ride. The late afternoon light filtered weakly through the gray clouds, casting strange shadows across the snow-laden pines. Levi found himself watching her more closely now, noting how she handled the horse with surprising confidence for someone supposedly blind. When they came to a section of trail scattered with loose rocks, she guided her mount around them without a single misstep. His suspicions grew stronger with each passing minute. The temperature continued to drop as they gained elevation. Their breath came out in white clouds, and ice was starting to form in the horses' manes. When they reached the half-frozen creek that marked the halfway point to his homestead, Levi reined in. "Ah! We'll water the horses here," he said, dismounting into the knee-deep snow. "It's the last good water before my place." Tessa nodded and swung down from her saddle with practiced ease. She steadied herself with one hand on the mare's shoulder, then lifted her face toward him. Their eyes met directly, no wandering or unfocused gaze that he'd expect from someone who couldn't see. The last of his doubts crystallized into certainty. The silence between them grew thick as snow continued to fall, muffling all sound except the quiet lapping of the creek against its icy edges. The horses dropped their heads to drink, steam rising from their nostrils. "You can see, can't you?" Levi finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. Tessa's shoulders tensed. For a long moment she said nothing, her fingers tightening on the saddle leather. Then she drew a deep breath that shuddered slightly in her chest. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I can see." Why the deception? She turned slightly away from him, her profile sharp against the white landscape. "After my mother died, men started showing interest. My father ... She paused, swallowing hard. "He decided if I was blind, they'd leave me alone. Said no man wants damaged goods." Anger flickered through Levi's chest, but he kept his voice level. "And today, he's been drinking more, gambling away everything we had." Her words came faster now, as if the truth once started couldn't be contained. "I tried to stop him, tried to hide some money for food when he found out." She shook her head. "He said if I was so clever, I wasn't worth keeping around anymore. That he'd get rid of me one way or another." The implications of those words hung heavy in the snowy air. If Levi hadn't stepped forward at the auction, there was no telling what might have happened to her. The thought made his jaw clench. "Mount up," he said after a moment. "We need to reach the cabin before dark." They rode the last few miles in silence, the snow falling steadily around them. The light was failing fast when they finally crested the last ridge. Below them, Levi's homestead spread out in a natural hollow sheltered by towering pines. Smoke rose straight from the cabin's stone chimney into the still air. "Home?" Levi said simply, leading the way down the slope. They stabled the horses quickly, efficiently. Levi showed Tessa where to find hay and tools, noting how she paid careful attention to each detail. When they finally stepped into the cabin, warmth and the rich smell of beef stew enveloped them. "Mrs. Winters from the valley comes up twice a week to help with cooking and cleaning," Levi explained, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. "She must have left the stew on to warm." Tessa stood just inside the door, taking in the simple but well-kept interior. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Worn but clean rugs covered the plank floor, and solid furniture, a table, chairs, and a cushioned settee, filled the main room. 2 doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms. "We need to establish some rules," Levi said, moving to stir the stew pot hanging over the fire. "First, no more pretending to be blind." "Not here." Tessa nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Second, if you're able to work, you will. There's plenty to be done on a ranch even in winter. Mrs. Winters can teach you what you need to know about the house. Third, ... He turned to face her directly. "You're safe here. No one will harm you, and you don't have to fear your father finding you. You can stay until spring, then decide your own path." "And what do you want in return?" Tessa asked quietly, her eyes wary despite his assurances. "Just honest work and honest words," Levi replied. "Nothing more." She studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for some hidden meaning in his expression. Finally, she gave a small nod. "I agree to your terms." "Good." He gestured toward the table. "Sit, eat. You look half frozen." As Tessa settled into a chair by the fire, she couldn't help but glance around the cabin again. The walls were solid, the roof sound, the air warm and filled with the smell of good food. By any measure, it was far better than what she'd left behind. Yet as she watched Levi move about the kitchen with quiet efficiency, she wondered if she had truly gained freedom, or simply traded one form of confinement for another. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the gathering night. Dawn crept over the snow-covered mountains, painting the world in shades of pale gold. Inside the cabin, Tessa stirred as rich aromas wafted through the air. Coffee and bacon. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar rafters, and for a moment, confusion gripped her before memory returned. She was in Levi Hale's cabin, far from her father's reach. The wooden floor was cold beneath her feet as she dressed quickly in the small bedroom he'd given her. She'd slept better than expected in the narrow but comfortable bed, exhausted from yesterday's long ride through the snow. When she emerged, she found Levi already moving about the main room, his coat dusted with fresh snow. "Been up since before first light," he said by way of greeting, hanging his axe by the door. "Had to check the stock and split more wood. Storm's coming later." He gestured to the coffee pot on the wooden table. "Help yourself." Tessa poured a cup, warming her hands around the thick ceramic mug. Through the window, she could see neat stacks of firewood piled against the cabin's outer wall, testament to his early morning labors. The bacon sizzled in a cast-iron pan over the hearth fire, and Levi added some eggs to cook alongside it. They ate in companionable silence, the cabin quiet except for the crackling fire and the occasional clink of forks against plates. When they'd finished, Levi pushed back his chair and fixed her with a serious look. "Winter up here isn't kind to those who aren't prepared," he said. "You need to learn the essentials fast." He stood, motioning for her to follow. "Come on, I'll show you what needs doing." The morning air bit sharp and clean as they stepped outside. Levi led her on a circuit around the cabin, pointing out the critical elements of mountain survival. "Firewood's our lifeline," he explained, showing her the different piles. "Green wood here for later seasoning, dry split wood there for immediate use. We'll need more than you think." They moved on to a small spring house built into the hillside. "Creek can freeze, but the spring runs year-round. Keep the path cleared or you'll break your neck fetching water." Inside the cabin again, he showed her the store of spare tools, needles, and thread. Everything needs mending sooner or later. Clothes, tack, tools, can't just run to town when something breaks. Tessa absorbed it all carefully, asking questions that revealed her quick understanding. When they headed to the barn later that morning, she showed the same focused attention as Levi demonstrated how to properly care for the horses. "You've handled horses before," he observed, as she confidently ran the curry comb over her mare's coat. "My mother taught me, before she died," Tessa replied softly. "Father couldn't stop me from helping in the stable, as long as I kept up the blind act in public." Around midday, they saddled up to ride down to the neighbor's fence line. Fresh snow had caused a break that needed mending before any cattle could stray. The winter sun hung pale in a crystal-clear sky as they made their way down the slope, their horses' hooves crunching through the crusty surface of the snow. They were nearly finished with the fence repairs when Tessa straightened suddenly, her eyes scanning the tree line. "There's a wolf watching us," she said calmly, nodding toward a shadow among the pines. "Has been for a few minutes now." Levi turned slowly, surprised she'd noticed before he had. Sure enough, a large gray wolf stood partially concealed in the forest's edge, its yellow eyes fixed on them with unnerving intelligence. It was unusual to see one alone, and so bold in daylight. "Best finish up quick," he said, keeping his voice steady while watching the wolf. "They don't usually come this close unless they're desperate or sick." They completed the fence repair efficiently and mounted up, the wolf following their progress from the cover of the trees. Only when they'd ridden well away did it finally melt back into the forest. "You've got sharp eyes," Levi commented as they rode home. "Most folks wouldn't have spotted that wolf so quick." "Had to be observant, pretending not to see," Tessa replied. "You notice more when people think you're blind." The sun was setting by the time they returned to the cabin. While Tessa tended to the horses, Levi got a stew going for their supper. The cabin was warm and welcoming after the long day outside, but tension crept into the air as they sat down to eat. "There's something we need to discuss," Levi said, his expression grave. "Word travels fast in these mountains, even in winter. By now, everyone who was at that auction has spread the story of how I bought you from your father." Tessa's face went pale, her spoon freezing halfway to her mouth. "But we're so far from town." "Distance won't stop gossip," Levi said firmly. "Some will say I bought you for improper reasons. Others will make up worse stories. That's the way of small communities. They talk, and talk breeds trouble." "I thought—" Tessa set her spoon down, her hands trembling slightly. "I thought being away from my father meant I was safe." "Physical safety, yes, but reputation?" Levi shook his head. "That's another kind of danger. The real fight might just be starting." Tessa stared into her bowl, shoulders tense. "What can we do?" "For now, we keep to ourselves, work hard, and give them nothing real to talk about." Levi's voice was steady, reassuring. "Come spring, you'll have choices to make. But until then, we weather the storm like any other." 2 days passed in a blur of chores and winter preparations. On the morning of the third day, frost etched delicate patterns across the cabin's windows as Levi hitched the wagon for a necessary supply run to town. The horse's breath came out in thick white clouds in the bitter morning air. Tessa emerged from the cabin wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her shoulders squared with determination, despite her visible nervousness about facing the town. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside Levi, who merely nodded and clicked to the horses. The wagon wheels creaked through the fresh snow as they began their descent from the mountain homestead. The journey took most of the morning, the horses carefully picking their way down the snow-covered trail. As they approached the town, Tessa pulled the shawl closer around her face, but kept her head high. No more pretending to be blind, she reminded herself, though the habit of ducking her head and avoiding eye contact tugged at her. The Mercantile's bell jingled as they entered, and the warm interior was a welcome respite from the cold. But the whispers started immediately. 2 women near the fabric bolts turned their backs, their hushed voices carrying just enough for words like scandal and "bought her" to reach Tessa's ears. The storekeeper's wife, arranging jars on a shelf, nearly dropped one when she saw who had entered. Levi seemed to ignore it all, methodically working through his supply list. Flour, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil. He moved through the store with purpose, adding items to their pile on the counter. Tessa stayed close to him, fighting the urge to shrink into herself as more customers entered, each bringing fresh waves of whispers and stares. As Levy settled their account, the storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, leaned in close. "Hale, you should know. That Quinn fellow's been running his mouth over at the saloon since noon yesterday. Claims you stole his girl, says you owe him compensation." He glanced around before continuing in an even lower voice. "Sheriff Morton's been asking questions, too. Might take an interest in the situation." Levi's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Appreciate the warning, Jenkins." They loaded the supplies quickly, eager to be away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues. But as they passed the saloon, Tessa caught sight of her father through the window. Ezekiel Quinn stood at the bar, gesturing wildly to his audience, his face flushed with drink even at this early hour. The sight of him made her stomach clench. Once they were well out of town, Tessa finally voiced the fear that had been building all morning. "What happens if my father tries to claim me back?" Her fingers twisted in her shawl. "Legally, I mean." Levi was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully as the wagon creaked beneath them. "Law tends to favor bloodkin in these matters," he admitted finally. "Unless there's clear proof of abuse or abandonment, selling your own daughter at auction might count, but..." He shook his head. "Law out here can be unpredictable." They rode in silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the cabin, the sun was already sliding toward the mountains. While Levi unloaded the heavier supplies, Tessa gathered her courage and spoke up. "Let me cook supper tonight," she offered. "I want to do my part, pull my weight here." When he looked like he might protest, she added, "I'm a good cook." "It's the least I can do, considering everything." Levi studied her for a moment, then nodded. "There's venison in the spring house that needs using." In the cabin's kitchen area, Tessa moved with quiet efficiency, showing the same competence she'd displayed with the horses. Soon, a hearty venison stew simmered over the fire, filling the cabin with savory aromas. As she worked, she spoke carefully about her other skills. "I can sew well enough to make and mend clothing," she said, stirring the pot. "I know how to repair harness, too. Learned that in the stable. And I kept my father's ledgers when he was sober enough to care about keeping records." Levi listened without comment, but when she paused, he turned the conversation to the weather instead. "Storms coming in from the west," he observed, gesturing to the window where heavy clouds were building, dark and ominous against the dimming sky. "Might be a big one." As night fell, the wind picked up strength, howling around the cabin's corners and rattling the shutters with increasing violence. The approaching storm seemed to mirror the growing tensions from town, full of uncertain threats and growing pressure. Tessa ladled out 2 bowls of stew, setting them on the table where Levi had laid out fresh bread from town. The wind's fury increased as they ate, making the cabin's logs creak and moan. Every few minutes, the shutters would bang against the walls, making Tessa jump slightly, despite her attempts to appear calm. Through it all, the whispers and stares from town kept replaying in her mind, along with the image of her father holding court in the saloon, plotting who knew what kind of revenge. The storm descended upon them with tremendous force that night. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, driven sideways by howling winds that made the cabin's timbers groan. By morning, drifts had climbed halfway up the windows, transforming the world outside into a blank white canvas. Tessa woke early, stoking the dying embers and adding fresh logs until warmth began to seep back into the cabin's main room. She found Levi already bundled up by the door, preparing to check on the livestock in the barn. "Stay inside," he said firmly, pulling his collar up against the wind. "No sense in both of us fighting through this." While he was gone, Tessa took stock of their supplies. She organized the pantry shelves, counting sacks of flour and dried goods, arranging everything so similar items stayed together. When Levi returned, snow crusted on his coat and boots, she had coffee brewing and breakfast nearly ready. The storm showed no signs of letting up. By midday, Tessa had settled into a rhythm of productive tasks. She found Levi's mending pile, work shirts with torn sleeves and missing buttons, and set herself up near the window where the light was best. Her neat stitches made quick work of the repairs while Levi wrote in his ledger at the table, occasionally glancing up to watch her work. That evening, as wind rattled the shutters, Tessa discovered enough ingredients to make bread. The familiar process of mixing and kneading helped calm her nerves about being trapped by the storm. Soon, the cabin filled with the homey scent of baking bread, making it feel less like the bare shelter it had been. They ate supper by the fire, the fresh bread still warm. After some hesitation, Tessa asked about the photograph she'd noticed on the mantel, a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. Levi was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, his voice rough, he spoke of his wife Sarah, lost to fever 5 winters past. "Tried everything," he said, staring into the flames. "But up here, so far from doctors?" He left the rest unsaid. "The cabin's been more like a bunkhouse since then," he admitted. "Just a place to sleep between working days." Tessa understood loss. She shared a little about her own mother, taken by the same fever that had nearly claimed her as a child. The conversation flowed easier after that, sharing fragments of their past as the storm raged outside. The second day dawned much like the first. Tessa baked again, this time trying her hand at biscuits. She continued organizing while Levi made his trips to check the animals, creating better systems for their stores and supplies. They fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine, sharing meals and quiet conversation as the hours passed. By the third morning, the storm's fury had spent itself. Tessa woke to silence. No more howling wind or rattling shutters. Sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, and when she peered outside, the sight took her breath away. Every pine branch drooped under its burden of snow, glittering like diamonds in the morning light. Levi came in from the barn, bringing a blast of cold air with him. "Storm's broken," he announced. "Thought we might ride up to check the herd in the high pasture, see how they weathered it." Tessa agreed eagerly, grateful for a chance to get outside after 3 days indoors. They saddled up and set out, their horses breaking trail through snow that reached past their knees in places. The world seemed transformed, familiar landmarks buried under smooth white drifts, everything peaceful and new. Despite the cold that pinched at her cheeks and nose, Tessa felt exhilarated. She rode steadily beside Levi, matching his pace as they climbed toward the high pasture. Her mare picked her way carefully through the deep snow, and Tessa handled her with a confidence that didn't escape Levi's notice. Near the fence line, they found most of the herd grouped together for warmth. As they rode among the cattle, checking for signs of distress, Tessa spotted a calf standing slightly apart from the others. Its ear showed the telltale white patches of frostbite. Without waiting for instruction, she dismounted and waded through the snow toward it. From her pocket, she pulled a clean cloth she'd brought along just in case. The calf, likely hurting, tried to shy away. But Tessa spoke to it softly, the way she'd learned to calm skittish horses in her father's stable. "Easy now," she murmured, reaching out slowly. "Let me help you." Levi sat motionless on his horse, watching as she gently wrapped the calf's injured ear. Her movements were sure and practiced, showing no fear of the much larger mother cow that hovered nearby. The whole scene, Tessa knee-deep in snow, tending to his stock with such natural care, struck him deeply. She fit here, he realized, as if she'd always been part of this life. When she finished, Tessa remounted with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in all her tasks these past 3 days. She caught Levi studying her and offered a small smile. Her cheeks flushed from cold and exertion. "There's another band of cattle usually grazes up by the creek," he said, turning his horse toward the north. "Should check them, too, while we're out." Tessa nodded and fell in beside him, as comfortable in the saddle as she'd been at his hearth. The sun continued to sparkle on the pristine snow around them as they rode deeper into the winter-transformed landscape of the high country. The January morning dawned bitter cold, frost painting delicate patterns across the cabin's windows. Levi had risen before first light, preparing for a short cattle run to check on a group of strays reported near Thompson's Creek. Though the deep winter thaw hadn't arrived yet, the trail was finally passable enough for necessary travel. "I should be back by nightfall," Levi said, adjusting his coat collar against the chill as he stood by the door. He handed Tessa a carefully written list. "These need tending While I'm gone. Tessa nodded, reading through the tasks, mostly routine chores she'd grown familiar with over the past weeks. The old herding dog Buck lay by the hearth, thumping his tail when Levi gave him a stern look. "Stay alert, Buck. Watch over things here." The dog woofed softly in acknowledgement, and Tessa couldn't help but smile at their exchange. She'd grown fond of the gentle guardian who followed her everywhere when Levi was away. "We'll manage just fine," she assured him, tucking the list into her apron pocket. After Levi rode out, Tessa set about her morning routine. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, and made sure the barn cats had fresh water that hadn't frozen. The familiar work kept her warm despite the cold, and Buck stayed close, his breath making little clouds in the frosty air. The sun had climbed to mid-morning height when she heard hoofbeats approaching. At first, she thought Levi had returned early, but Buck's low growl told her otherwise. A stranger rode up to the cabin, a well-dressed man wearing a bowler hat, his horse a sleek bay that looked out of place among the hardy mountain stock. "Good morning, miss," he called out, his voice smooth as creek ice. "I'm Mr. Herrick, representing Western Territories Land Company." He dismounted with practiced ease, brushing invisible dust from his coat sleeve. "I have business to discuss regarding this property." Tessa stood straighter, one hand resting on Buck's collar. "Mr. Hale isn't here at present." "That's quite all right." Herrick reached into his satchel, producing an official-looking document. "This concerns the high pasture he's been using for his herd. I'm afraid there's been a change in ownership. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Tessa's stomach." "What do you mean?" "I've purchased the rights to that land." He held out the paper with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Signed and proper, as you can see." Tessa took the document, her heart sinking as she recognized her father's unsteady signature at the bottom. Ezekiel Quinn's name was scrawled across the deed in the shaky handwriting she knew came from his drinking. "This can't be legal," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "That land belongs to Mr. Hale." "I'm afraid Mr. Hale never properly filed his claim." Herrick's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. "Now, if you'll invite me in, we can discuss the terms of vacating the pasture by spring. The sheriff will need to be involved if—" "No," Tessa cut him off, Buck's growl growing louder beside her. "You'll need to return when Mr. Hale is here to discuss this matter." Herrick's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "Miss Quinn, yes, I know who you are. Your father was quite clear about his right to sell this land. It would be better for everyone if you cooperated." "I won't invite you into this house," Tessa said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "You can return to speak with Mr. Hale directly." They stood in tense silence before Herrick finally inclined his head. "As you wish, but do inform Mr. Hale that he has until the spring thaw to remove his cattle, or the sheriff will assist in their removal." He mounted his horse with the same precise movements he'd shown before. "Good day, Miss Quinn." Tessa watched until he disappeared down the trail, Buck still rumbling low in his throat. Only then did she let herself shake properly, sitting down hard on the porch steps. The dog pressed against her side, offering warm comfort as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She spent the rest of the day going through her chores mechanically, jumping at every sound from the trail. The deed lay on the kitchen table where she'd placed it, seeming to mock her with its official seals and her father's treacherous signature. When dusk approached, she kept the stove fire hot and water ready for coffee, knowing Levi would be cold from his long ride. The sound of his horse finally approaching brought both relief and anxiety. She dreaded having to tell him about Herrick's visit. Levi stamped the snow from his boots at the door, his face reddened from the wind. He took one look at her expression and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Tessa explained everything. Herrick's arrival, his claims about the land, the deed with her father's signature, and his threats about the sheriff. When she finished, Levi stood silent for a long moment, staring at the document on the table. Finally, he picked it up, studying it in the lamplight. "It's a fake," he muttered, turning it over in his hands. "Has to be, but proving that will take time we might not have." "I'm so sorry," Tessa whispered. "My father, I never thought he'd. This isn't your doing. Levi cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. Ezekiel's been trying to cause trouble since that day at the auction. We won't let his schemes drive us apart. The way he said us made something warm bloom in Tessa's chest, pushing back against the cold fear that had gripped her all day. Still, she could see the worry in his eyes as he set the deed aside and moved to warm himself by the stove. "What will we do?" she asked softly. "Fight it," Levi answered, his jaw set with determination. "That pasture's been part of this ranch since my father's time. Herrick and his kind think they can push mountain folk around with fancy papers and threats. They're wrong." Tessa wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the calculated look in Herrick's eyes. This wasn't a simple land dispute. It was a carefully planned attack on Levi's livelihood. As she poured him coffee and set about preparing their evening meal, she couldn't shake the feeling that her father's schemes had set something dangerous in motion. Dawn broke with a pale winter sun, barely warming the frosted window panes of the cabin. Levi had been up since before first light, his mind turning over the problem of Herrick's fraudulent deed. Over breakfast, he watched Tessa methodically butter her biscuit, her movements careful and precise. "We're riding out this morning," he announced, pushing his empty coffee cup aside. "There's someone we need to see." Tessa looked up, curiosity brightening her eyes. "Who?" "Jonas. He's an Apache elder who lives near the reservation boundary. If anyone knows the true history of these lands, it's him." Levi stood, reaching for his coat. "He's helped settle boundary disputes before." They saddled up quickly, the horse's breath making clouds in the cold morning air. The trail led them east, winding through stands of pine and across shallow creek beds. Tessa rode confidently now, her body moving in natural rhythm with her mount. Levi found himself watching her more than the path, noting how she'd grown comfortable in the saddle these past weeks. After an hour's ride, they approached a small cabin tucked against a south-facing slope. Smoke curled from the chimney, and several well-tended horses grazed in a nearby paddock. An elderly man stepped onto the porch as they approached, his dark eyes sharp beneath silver hair. "Levi Hale!" he called out in greeting, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "The winter brings you early this year." Levi dismounted, helping Tessa down before approaching the porch. "Jonas, we need your counsel, if you're willing to give it." The old man's gaze shifted to Tessa, studying her with quiet intensity. After a moment he nodded and gestured toward his door. "Come inside. The wind bites today." The cabin's interior was warm and smelled of wood smoke and strong coffee. Jonas moved with deliberate grace, pouring 3 cups from a battered pot on his wood stove. When they were seated, Levi explained about Herrick's visit and the deed bearing Ezekiel's signature. Jonas listened without interruption, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When Levi finished, the elder set his cup down and spoke in measured tones. "I remember when your father first claimed that pasture," he said to Levi. "The treaty line runs clear. That high meadow was never part of the lands that could be sold separately. Your father understood this. He respected the boundaries." Hope flickered in Levi's chest. Could you testify to that, if it came to court? Jonas's expression grew thoughtful. "The white man's court does not always value native words, even when they speak truth." He turned to Tessa suddenly, addressing her in Apache, his voice carrying a different rhythm in his native tongue. "You walk like someone who sees the truth." Tessa blinked in surprise, unable to understand the words but clearly feeling their weight. Jonas switched back to English, a slight smile touching his lips. "But yes, I will speak if needed. The land story should be told correctly." They talked longer, Jonas sharing details about the original survey markers and boundary stones that might help their case. When they finally stood to leave, the old man pressed a small packet of dried herbs into Tessa's hands. "For clear thinking," he explained. "The days ahead may need it." The ride home seemed shorter, though the sun was already westering when they reached the cabin. As they unsaddled the horses, Levi finally voiced what had been weighing on his mind. "Jonas's testimony would help if we can get the county judge to hear it. Judge Parker's known to be fair-minded, but he shook his head. Some men won't accept native testimony no matter how true. Tessa nodded, understanding the complexity of their situation. At least we know we're right, she said softly. That has to count for something. Inside the cabin, they settled into their evening routine. Tessa picked up a broken stirrup that needed mending, her nimble fingers working the leather with practiced ease. Levi found a weeks-old newspaper he hadn't finished reading and settled into his chair by the lamp. The quiet that fell between them was comfortable, broken only by the crack of the fire and the soft sounds of Tessa's work with the leather. Levi found himself reading the same paragraph several times, distracted by her presence across the room. The lamplight caught gold highlights in her hair as she bent over her mending, and her focused expression reminded him of how far she'd come from that first day at the auction. Though neither spoke of it, they were both acutely aware of each other in the room. It was there in the way Tessa glanced up occasionally to check if his coffee cup needed refilling, in how Levi shifted his chair slightly so the lamplight would better fall on her work. These small considerations had become their language, speaking volumes in the quiet evening hours. When Tessa finally held up the mended stirrup for inspection, satisfaction clear in her face, Levi folded his newspaper away. The work was neat and strong, like everything else she put her hand to. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, how anyone could have tried to diminish her worth the way her father had. The evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket, each absorbed in their tasks, yet connected by the shared warmth of home and hearth. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had this moment of peace, built on trust and growing understanding. February swept into the high country like a hungry wolf, bringing winds that howled through the pine trees and rattled the cabin's shutters. Tessa stood at the kitchen window, watching snow devils dance across the yard while Levi showed her how to set snares for rabbits. The trick is knowing their paths, he explained, demonstrating with a length of wire. They're creatures of habit, especially in winter when food is scarce. Tessa proved to be a quick study. Within days, she was bringing home rabbits, her cheeks flushed with pride as she learned to clean them properly. The rich aroma of rabbit stew soon filled the cabin regularly, mixed with herbs she'd dried earlier in winter. One crisp afternoon, while gathering kindling near the half-frozen creek, Tessa's boot found a patch of hidden ice. Her ankle twisted sharply as she fell, sending the gathered wood scattering. The pain shot up her leg like fire, bringing tears to her eyes. Levi heard her cry from where he was chopping wood nearby. He reached her in moments, his face tight with worry as he knelt beside her. "Don't move," he ordered, his gruff voice carrying an edge of concern she'd never heard before. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms, cradling her against his chest. "I can probably walk," Tessa protested weakly, though she found herself instinctively curling into his warmth. "Not on that ankle, you won't," he replied, carrying her steadily back to the cabin. His jaw was set, but his hold remained gentle as he navigated the door and settled her carefully in his chair by the fire. He wrapped her ankle with practiced hands, his fingers careful on the swollen joint. "You'll rest this," he said firmly. "No arguments." For the next week, Levi took on her chores without complaint, feeding the stock and keeping the fires burning. Tessa, confined to the cabin's warmth, turned her attention to finishing a quilt she'd been piecing together from scraps. The pattern was simple but the stitching neat, and the extra warmth would be welcome on cold nights. By week's end, her ankle had healed enough to walk without pain. That Sunday morning, Levi surprised her by hitching up a small sleigh, complete with bells that jingled merrily in the crisp air. "Thought we might go to services," he said, helping her into the sleigh and tucking a heavy blanket around her legs. The little wooden chapel was already warm with bodies when they arrived, lamplight glowing in its windows. They found a seat near the back, and when the congregation stood to sing, Tessa's clear voice rose with the familiar hymn. Beside her, Levi's deeper tones joined in, their voices weaving together naturally. The usual whispers and sideways glances stilled as their harmonized voices filled the small space. Tessa felt the change in the air, saw how some of the harder faces softened as the hymn continued. For a moment, the weight of gossip lifted, replaced by something gentler, more accepting. In that sacred space, surrounded by candlelight and song, Tessa sensed a shift in how the townspeople viewed them. It wasn't acceptance, not quite yet, but it was a beginning. The clear February night spread like a dark blanket over the mountains, studded with countless stars that sparkled like frost on pine needles. Tessa pulled her wool coat tighter as she followed Levi on their final check of the stock before turning in. Their breath clouded in the frigid air, while they counted heads in the closer pasture. 23, Tessa called out, her voice carrying in the still night. She'd gotten good at quick counts, even in the dim light. Levi nodded, satisfaction evident in his stance. Same as this morning, that's... He stopped mid-sentence when Tessa suddenly grabbed his arm. Look, she whispered, pointing toward the ridge. There's a light moving up there. Levi's eyes narrowed as he tracked the bobbing glow. It weaved between the trees with purpose, too steady and controlled to be moonlight playing tricks. That's no natural light, he said grimly. Someone's up there with a lantern. Herrick? Tessa asked, her fingers tightening on his sleeve. Wouldn't put it past him. Levi's jaw clenched. He's probably scouting the pasture, looking for ways to strengthen his claim. He turned toward the barn. Come on, we're riding up there. They saddled their horses quickly, working in practiced unison. The animals' hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they picked their way up the slope. Tessa kept her eyes fixed on the moving light, which continued its methodical path along the ridge. As they drew closer, the light suddenly winked out. Levi urged his horse faster, but when they reached the spot where they'd last seen the glow, they found only tracks in the fresh snow leading into the dense timber. He's slipped away, Levi muttered, frustration evident in his voice. He dismounted to examine the prints. These are fresh. Couldn't have been more than a minute ahead of us. Tessa slid down from her saddle, careful to stay close as she peered into the darkness between the trees. Should we follow? Levi shook his head. Too dangerous in this darkness. He knows we spotted him, that's what matters. He remounted, extending a hand to help Tessa back onto her horse. But this ends when the pass opens. We're taking this to court. Back at the cabin, the warmth of the fire welcomed them, but neither felt ready for sleep. Tessa hung their coats while Levi stoked the flames higher. I could help, she offered, watching him pace. With organizing your land papers, I mean. I'm good with records. Used to keep all the books for my father's trading before. She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. I know how to document things properly. Levi stopped pacing and studied her for a long moment. Finally, he nodded and moved to a trunk near his desk. Everything's in here. Never was much for paperwork myself. Together, they cleared the kitchen table and began sorting through years of documents. Tessa created neat piles, deeds, receipts, correspondence with the land office. Her quick eyes caught details Levi might have missed, and her steady hand made clear notes on fresh paper. The lamp between them cast a warm pool of light as they worked. Levi found himself watching her hands as she sorted and organized, admiring the sure way she handled each document. She had a system, explaining it as she went, and he could see how it would help their case. These receipts prove you've been working this land continuously, she said, tapping a stack of papers. And here, she pulled out an older document. This shows the original survey markers. If we can prove those haven't moved. You're good at this, Levi said quietly, meaning more than just the paperwork. Tessa looked up, meeting his eyes across the table. I want to help. This is your home, your life's work. We can't let them take it with false claims. The word we hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to voice. As they gathered the organized documents to pack them away, Levi's fingers brushed against hers. The touch was brief, probably accidental, but it sent awareness skittering through them both. Neither spoke for a moment. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to the night. The air in the cabin felt charged, like the stillness before a storm. Tessa carefully tied the stack of papers with string, while Levi locked the strong box, each intensely aware of the other's presence just inches away. The simple domesticity of the scene, the lamp's glow, their shared purpose, the quiet companionship of the late hour, spoke louder than words. They had become partners in this fight, their fates intertwined by more than just circumstance. March arrived with warmer winds that whispered of spring, though patches of stubborn snow still clung to the shadowed hollows. The morning sun had started to soften the frozen ground when Levi mounted up for his ride to town. He adjusted his hat against the glare, watching Tessa feed the chickens in the yard. "Should be back before dark," he called to her. "Got the papers organized just like you showed me." Tessa nodded, dusting feed from her apron. "Good luck with the filing. I'll have supper waiting." He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse toward town, the saddlebags heavy with their carefully prepared documents. The trail was muddy but passable, the first real thaw of the season turning winter's grip to slush. Back at the cabin, Tessa settled into her daily routine. She had just pulled fresh bread from the oven when hoofbeats approached from the south trail. Her heart quickened. It was too early for Levi's return. Moving to the window, she saw a familiar figure weaving in the saddle, and her blood ran cold. Ezekiel Quinn dismounted clumsily, catching himself on the hitching post. Even from inside, Tessa could smell the whiskey on him. He stumbled toward the cabin, his face flushed from drink and the cool air. "Girl," he bellowed, pounding on the door, "open up! Your father's come to fetch you home." Tessa's hands trembled, but she steadied herself. "Go away," she called through the door. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Like hell you ain't." Ezekiel rattled the latch. "You're my flesh and blood, and you're coming with me now. Pack your things." "No." Tessa's voice grew stronger. "You sold me, remember? In front of the whole town." A harsh laugh scraped through the wood. "Sold you? Girl, you're underage. You're my property till you're 21. That makes any sale null and void." He kicked the door, making it shudder in its frame. "Now open up before I break this down." Tessa backed away, her mind racing. The rifle was in Levi's room, too far to reach if her father did break through. But she knew Ezekiel's drunken rages usually burned out quick if denied fuel. "I said no," she shouted back. "Leave now, or Levi will have the sheriff on you for trespassing." The pounding stopped. After a moment of silence, Ezekiel's voice came lower, more dangerous. "That's how it is? Think your fancy rancher can keep you? Well, we'll see what the law says about that." His boots scraped on the porch. "You just wait. I'm bringing the sheriff out here tomorrow. We'll see who's trespassing then." She listened to him stumble back to his horse, muttering curses and threats. Only when the sound of hoofbeats faded did she sink into a chair, her legs weak with relief and fear. The afternoon crawled by. Tessa tried to keep busy, but every distant sound made her jump. She kept the rifle close as she did her chores, watching the trail for any sign of her father's return. The sun was setting when Levi finally rode in. One look at his face told her the filing hadn't gone smoothly, but his expression darkened further when he saw the rifle propped by the door. "What happened?" he demanded, quickly dismounting. Tessa told him about Ezekiel's visit as she helped him unsaddle his horse. With each detail, Levi's jaw clenched tighter. By the time they reached the cabin, his anger was a palpable thing. "He threatened to break down my door?" Levi's voice was deadly quiet. "Here, at my home?" "He was drunk," Tessa said, though it was no excuse. "But he seems serious about bringing the sheriff tomorrow. He claims I'm still legally his because I'm underage." Levi strode to the fireplace, his movements stiff with rage. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the flames. Finally, he turned back to her. "How old are you, Tessa?" "Really?" She swallowed hard. 19, almost 20. He cursed under his breath. Young enough that he might have a claim then. Damn him. They prepared supper in tense silence. Tessa's hands shook slightly as she served the stew, and she could barely eat. The fear she'd been holding back all afternoon finally spilled out. "What if they make me go back?" Her voice cracked. I won't survive going back to that life. Pretending to be blind, watching him drink away everything we earn, being traded like cattle. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold back tears. Tessa! Levi's voice was rough with emotion. He reached across the table and gently pulled her hands away, holding them in his larger ones. Look at me. She raised her eyes to his, seeing the fierce determination there. I won't let him take you, Levi said, each word weighted with iron. Not while I've got breath in me. We'll fight this, through the courts if we can, or any other way we have to. You're not his property. You're not anyone's property. The strength in his grip, the unwavering conviction in his voice, steadied her. She drew a shaky breath and nodded. Whatever comes tomorrow, he continued, remember that. You have a home here as long as you want it, and I'll stand between you and anyone who tries to say different. His thumbs traced small circles on her palms, a gesture probably meant to comfort, but it sent warmth spreading through her chest. They sat like that for a long moment, connected by more than just their joined hands, while the fire crackled and the wind whispered around the cabin's corners. Finally, Levi gave her hands a gentle squeeze before releasing them. We should get some rest. Tomorrow might be a long day. Tessa nodded, gathering their barely touched bowls. As she washed the dishes, she could hear Levi checking the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. His steady presence helped push back the fear that had haunted her all afternoon. Whatever came with the morning sun, she wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The early spring sun had begun its work on the snowdrifts, turning the mountain paths into a patchwork of mud and melting ice. 2 weeks after Ezekiel's threatening visit, Levi guided his wagon carefully down the rutted track toward town, with Tessa perched beside him on the wooden seat. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles white against the dark fabric of her best dress. Remember, Levi said quietly, just tell the truth. Plain and simple. The clerk needs facts, not flourishes. Tessa nodded, watching the town's scattered buildings come into view. What if Father shows up? Then we deal with it. Levi's jaw tightened. But the law's got to see what kind of man he really is. Your testimony will help make that clear. They tied the wagon outside the clerk's office, a narrow wooden building wedged between the general store and the barber shop. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk, Mr. Peterson, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles, his quill poised above a thick ledger. Miss Quinn, he said formally, you understand you're here to give sworn testimony regarding the circumstances of your separation from your father? Yes, sir. Tessa's voice was steady, though Levi could see her fingers trembling as she smoothed her skirt. Just as the clerk began his questions, the door creaked open. Jonas stepped inside, his weathered face solemn beneath his gray hair. Levi straightened in surprise. I have words to add, Jonas announced quietly, about Ezekiel Quinn and his dealings. The clerk frowned but nodded, gesturing to a chair. For the next hour, the small office filled with testimonies. Tessa spoke clearly about her father's neglect, the forced pretense of blindness, and his final act of selling her at auction. Jonas followed with precise details of Ezekiel's fraudulent land claims and broken agreements with both settlers and the Apache people. As the clerk's quill scratched across page after page, hope began to bloom in Tessa's chest. Each word felt like another stone in the foundation of their case. When Mr. Peterson finally set down his pen, she caught Levi's eye and saw her own cautious optimism reflected there. I will file these statements with the judge, the clerk said, sprinkling sand over the wet ink. Given the serious nature of these accusations. The office door burst open, cutting off his words. Sheriff Mills filled the doorframe, his badge catching the late morning light. 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting on their gun belts. Levi Hale, the sheriff announced grimly. I have a warrant for your arrest. The room seemed to tilt beneath Tessa's feet. What? The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his vest. Complaint filed by Ezekiel Quinn for the unlawful abduction of his minor daughter. You'll need to come with us, Hale. This is nonsense, Levi said, his voice level despite the anger Tessa could see building in his eyes. I saved her from... Save it for the judge. Sheriff Mills gestured to his deputies. You can explain it all at your hearing. For now, You're spending some time in my jail." "No!" Tessa stepped forward, but Jonas caught her arm gently. "He didn't abduct me. I chose to go with him." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Miss, that's not for me to decide. I just enforce the laws written, and right now the law says your father has rights over you until you're of age." Levi stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. "It's all right, Tessa. We'll sort this out proper, through the courts." He turned to Jonas. "Would you make sure she gets home safe?" Jonas nodded solemnly. "I will watch over her." The deputies moved forward, but Levi held up a hand. "No need for those," he said, nodding at their handcuffs. "I'll go peaceful." Tessa could only watch, her throat too tight for words, as they led Levi out. Through the office window, she saw them walk him down the muddy street toward the small jailhouse at the edge of town. Her protector, her friend, her something more than either of those things, being taken away in front of the whole town's curious eyes. Jonas squeezed her shoulder. "Come, I will drive wagon back to cabin." The ride home passed in a blur. Jonas spoke quietly about patience and justice, but Tessa barely heard him. Her mind was already racing ahead, trying to find a way out of this trap her father had set. At the cabin, Jonas helped her unharness the horses and made sure she had enough firewood split. As the sun began to set, he reluctantly mounted his own horse to leave. "Do not lose heart," he told her. "Truth has power, even if it takes time to show itself." Tessa nodded, watching until he disappeared down the trail. Then she went inside, built up the fire, and sat in Levi's chair by the hearth. The mantel clock ticked loudly in the silence, each sound marking another moment Levi spent behind bars. She stared into the flames, remembering all the evenings they had shared in this room. Levi reading his newspaper while she sewed. The quiet conversations about cattle and weather that somehow always led to deeper things. The way his presence had filled this space, making it feel like home in a way she had never known before. The clock struck 8, its chimes startling her from her thoughts. She couldn't just sit here waiting for others to decide their fate. Levi had protected her when she needed it most. Now it was her turn to fight for him. Standing, Tessa moved to the desk where they had organized all their documents. Land deeds, letters, receipts, every scrap of paper that might prove Ezekiel's schemes. She began to sort through them methodically, looking for anything that might help free Levi. "I won't let them take this away," she whispered to the empty cabin. "Not our home, not our future." She would have to be careful, smart, and probably a little bit brave. But sitting alone in the growing darkness, Tessa realized that she had learned those things from Levi himself. Now, she would use them to save him. The mantel clock ticked on as she worked, marking the minutes until morning. The moon hung low over the mountains as Tessa moved quietly through the cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed a small leather satchel with essentials: bread, dried meat, and a water skin. She hesitated, then added the bundle of documents they had gathered about Ezekiel's dealings. Every piece of paper might matter now. She had waited until well past midnight, when the mountain silence settled deep and heavy around the cabin. Moving by memory through the familiar space, she pulled on her warmest coat and wrapped a wool scarf around her neck. The night air would be bitter, especially at a gallop. In the barn, the mare nickered softly as Tessa approached with the saddle. "Quiet now, girl," she whispered, running a gentle hand down the horse's neck. Her fingers worked quickly at the buckles, muscle memory taking over despite her racing thoughts. The leather creaked as she cinched the girth tight. The sound of an owl's hunting call made her freeze, but it was just night sounds, nothing more. Still, she led the mare out of the barn with extra care, not mounting until they were well away from any buildings that might echo hoofbeats. Tessa knew where her father would be camped. Ezekiel was a creature of habit, especially when drinking, and he always chose the same sheltered grove near Crystal Creek when staying outside of town. The spot offered protection from the wind and easy access to water, perfect for a man who rarely planned further ahead than his next bottle. The trail wound down through stands of pine, patches of moonlight alternating with deep shadow. Tessa kept the mare to a steady walk until they were safely past the rocky sections, then urged her into a ground-covering trot. The horse's breath came out in white puffs in the cold air. As they approached Crystal Creek, Tessa spotted the warm glow of a campfire through the trees. She dismounted quietly and tied the mare well back from the camp, then crept forward on foot. The sound of male voices carried clearly in the still night air. "Got it all arranged," Ezekiel was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Railroad man's offering good money for a wife. Says he's tired of eating his own cooking." He laughed, an ugly sound that made Tessa's skin crawl. "And you're certain she'll fetch the price you promised?" That was Herrick's voice, sharp and businesslike even in conspiracy. "I've put considerable effort into this land scheme. I won't be left holding worthless deeds if your plan falls through." "My girl'll bring twice what I said." Ezekiel took another drink. Tessa could hear the liquid sloshing in the bottle. "Pretty thing like her, even if she is stubborn. Railroad man won't care about that once she's properly broke to harness." Tessa pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her father was planning to sell her again, not just to be rid of her this time, but to pay off whatever he owed Herrick for their fraudulent land dealings. "When's this railroad fellow coming through?" Herrick asked. 3 days' time," Ezekiel belched. "Figured we'd have that meddling rancher in jail by then, and my girl'll have nowhere else to run." The two men continued talking, their voices growing more slurred as the bottle made its rounds. Tessa stayed hidden behind a fallen log, forcing herself to listen until she was certain she had heard every detail of their scheme. Only when their words dissolved into drunken snoring did she dare move. Her hands were numb with cold by the time she made it back to where the mare waited. The eastern sky was still dark, but dawn wasn't far off. She mounted quickly and turned the horse's head toward town, no longer worried about staying quiet. Speed mattered more now than stealth. The mare seemed to sense her urgency, stretching out into a ground-devouring gallop. The wind stung Tessa's face as they rode, but she barely noticed. Her mind was focused on what she would tell the sheriff, how to make him understand the truth of her father's crimes before it was too late. The first gray light of dawn was touching the mountain peaks when Tessa rode into town. A lamp still burned in the sheriff's office, and she could see movement behind the curtained windows. She dismounted, legs shaky from the long ride, and tied the mare to the hitching post. Sheriff Mills looked up in surprise when she burst through his door. "Miss Quinn? What in heaven's name?" "My father is selling me to pay his gambling debts," Tessa said, the words tumbling out. "He and Herrick planned it all. I heard them talking at Crystal Creek Camp. They're going to sell me to a railroad man in 3 days." The sheriff's expression hardened as Tessa explained everything she had overheard. When she mentioned the fraudulent land deeds, he began taking notes in a small leather book. "And you're willing to swear to all this?" he asked when she finished. "In front of a judge, if need be?" "Yes," Tessa's voice was firm. "I'll swear to every word." Sheriff Mills studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. He stood and opened the door to the deputy's room. "Boys, saddle up. We're riding out to make some arrests." The gray dawn had brightened to full morning by the time they set out. The sheriff, 2 deputies, and Tessa leading the way. She had insisted on coming along, despite the sheriff's initial protests. "If they try to deny it," she had argued, "they'll have to do it to my face." They found Ezekiel and Herrick still sleeping off their drunk at the camp, empty bottles scattered around the dead fire. The sheriff's approach was almost casual as he dismounted and walked over to kick Ezekiel's boot. "Rise and shine, gentlemen," he called out. "We need to have us a conversation about human trafficking and land fraud." The county courthouse was barely large enough to hold everyone who had crowded in for the hearing. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Tessa sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her hands folded in her lap to hide their slight trembling. The familiar faces of townspeople watched from the cramped benches, some curious, others sympathetic. Judge Harrison, a weathered man with steel-gray hair, adjusted his spectacles and looked up from the papers before him. "Miss Quinn, please tell the court about your situation with your father." Tessa took a deep breath, her voice clear and steady as she began. "When my mother died 6 years ago, my father changed. The drinking got worse, and he started losing money gambling. She paused, gathering her strength. He forced me to pretend I was blind. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ezekiel, seated between two deputies, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And why did he insist on this deception? The judge prompted. He said it would keep men from wanting to court me. He wanted to control who could. Tessa's voice caught slightly. Who could buy me, essentially. When I refused to go along with his schemes, he brought me to the livestock auction to trade me for winter provisions. The judge's expression darkened. And this is when Mr. Hale intervened? Yes, Your Honor. Levi, Mr. Hale. He saved me from public humiliation that day. He gave me honest work and a safe place to stay despite what people might think. From his seat near the front, Levi watched her testimony with quiet pride. The bruises of his jail stay were still visible on his face, but his eyes never left Tessa as she spoke. The judge turned his attention to Jonas, who had been waiting patiently in traditional Apache dress. Mr. Jonas, you have information about the land deed in question? Jonas rose slowly, his dignity evident in every movement. Yes, Judge. I have lived on this land for 68 years. The pasture Mr. Quinn claims to have sold has never been his to sell. The Treaty of 1873 clearly marked those grazing lands as open territory, later granted to Mr. Hale's family through legal purchase. He produced several yellowed documents from a leather pouch. These are the original survey maps, showing the true boundaries. I helped mark them myself as a young man. The judge examined the maps carefully, comparing them to the deed Herrick had presented. This newer deed appears to have been drawn up without proper survey references, he noted. And the signature. He held both documents to the light. Mr. Quinn's signature here differs significantly from his known hand on previous legal documents. Ezekiel started to protest, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. I've heard enough. This court finds the deed presented by Mr. Herrick to be fraudulent, and all charges against Levi Hale are hereby dismissed. Relief washed over Tessa's face as the judge continued. Furthermore, regarding Miss Quinn's status, given the evidence of her father's misconduct and her current age of 22 years, I grant her full legal independence. Mr. Quinn shall have no further claim on her person or property. The judge's gavel cracked against the wooden block with finality. Mr. Quinn and Mr. Herrick will remain in custody pending criminal charges. Court is adjourned. As people began filing out of the courthouse, many stopped to shake Levi's hand or pat his shoulder. The same townspeople who had whispered behind their hands weeks ago now offered warm words of support. Several of the women approached Tessa, welcoming her properly to the community for the first time. Outside on the courthouse steps, the spring sunshine felt especially warm. Groups of people lingered, talking, but their gossip had a different tone now. Tessa overheard phrases like brave girl and Hale's a good man, replacing the previous suspicious whispers. Sheriff Mills approached Levi with an outstretched hand. Sorry about the jail stay, Hale? Had to follow procedure, you understand. Levi shook the offered hand without hesitation. No hard feelings, Sheriff. Justice worked out in the end. Jonas waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching them. He spoke quietly in Apache to Tessa, then switched to English. You both fought with honor for what was right. The land knows its true guardians. The old man's words carried the weight of prophecy, though he smiled as he said them. He touched his hand to his heart in farewell and walked away, leaving Levi and Tessa standing together in the warming spring morning, their shadows stretching out behind them on the courthouse steps. Spring burst into the high country like a promise kept. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the greening pasture, where new calves wobbled on spindly legs beside their mothers. The creek, swollen with snowmelt, sang its rushing song through the valley. Fresh shoots of grass pushed through the slowly retreating patches of snow, and the air held the sweet scent of awakening earth. Levi and Tessa stood together on the cabin's front porch, watching the herd graze in the distance. The winter's trials had left their mark on both of them, but like the land itself, they had emerged stronger. Tessa's hair caught the golden light as she leaned against the porch rail, her eyes following a playful calf as it kicked up its heels in the sunshine. Levi cleared his throat softly, his usual confident manner giving way to something more uncertain. "Been thinking," he said, his voice low and careful, "about what happens now that spring's here." Tessa turned to face him, her expression open but guarded. The agreement had been until spring after all. "Way I see it," Levi continued, "you've got choices ahead of you. Could stay on as my hired hand. You've more than proved yourself capable." He paused, his hands gripping the porch rail. Or, the word hung in the air between them. Tessa's heart quickened as she waited. "Or you could stay as my wife." The words came out steady, despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "If you'd want that." A smile bloomed across Tessa's face, bright as the spring sunshine. "I'd want that," she said softly. "Very much." And they married in the small white church where they had once sung hymns together. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the fresh flowers that decorated the simple wooden pews. Friends and neighbors filled the seats, their previous suspicions transformed into genuine joy for the couple. Jonas sat in a place of honor, his weathered face serene as he watched the ceremony. That evening they sat together on their porch, now truly their porch, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of purple and gold. The air was cooling, but neither moved to go inside just yet. The moment felt too precious to break. Tessa's hand found Levi's in the gathering dusk. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you bought a blind girl at that auction and got a woman who could see you all along." Levi's fingers tightened around hers. "And you showed me what I'd been blind to, home." His voice carried all the warmth of the setting sun. "This place was just shelter before. You made it live again." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the mountains, the sound of the creek mixing with the evening calls of birds. After all the storms they'd weathered, this quiet moment held all the peace they'd fought so hard to win. "Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart,